We can now sync our data with Firebase. Let's start to build out our list of to-dos so the user can see what to-dos they have. We're going to start by creating a new file inside of our source directory called list.jsx. And then once we've got that file, we'll go through the usual boilerplate. So we'll say var react, require react, and we will export a React class. And we'll define our function, or render function, in which, for right now, we'll just return an empty UL. All right, so this component, this list, is going to be responsible for rendering a list of to-dos. Let's go ahead and just say that we're going to add another requirement to the project, and that is when the user has no to-dos, we should show them a message stating that they don't have any. So let's start off by implementing that. We're going to implement our base case, the case in which the user has no to-dos. So to get started, we'll save this file, and then we will flip back over to app.jsx, and we will require in our list. So we'll var list equals require, and then in this directory, find the file named list. Okay, so now we have our list component. It makes sense that we'll render it right beneath our header. So we'll just go ahead and say list. Okay, let's give list a little bit of data in here. And for right now, we know that we don't quite have access to any data just yet, but we will shortly. So let's go ahead and say that it's going to have a property items, and we're going to hand it this.state.items. So remember, when we defined our Firebase connection with React Fire, we bound our data as an object to this.state.items. So right here with this single little declaration, we are passing down our list of items down into list. Let's save this file, flip back over to our list component, and it looks like I got an error over here. We'll check that out in just a second here. And we'll say console.log this.props. And all we're going to do here is we're going to verify that we're getting our list of items down into this component. So I'm going to save this one. So it looks like we have an error in here, and it's cannot read property items of null. Okay, so this is kind of interesting. It doesn't know what items is because our state is currently null. That means that we need to go ahead and just initialize our state. So at the top, we'll do get initial state, and we'll say function, and we'll just return an object that has items. And remember, items is our representation of our Firebase data, which is going to be an object because we bound it as an object. So we're just going to default items to be an object for right now. Okay. By the way, if you ever get this error message working on your own projects, cannot read property blank of null, look to your state, especially if you just recently started manipulating your state. Chances are your state is null, and you just need to return an initial state. So let's go ahead and save this. Oops, forgot a comma. We'll flip back over, refresh the page, and okay, looks good. So remember a couple sections ago when we hooked up to Firebase and we console logged this.state.items, it first showed up as being null, or empty, and then it showed up as being, hey, there actually is something here. There's an object here. And there wasn't any data in it, but there was an object. So let's see what we have now. So we have console logged twice this.state.items. Let's look at the first one, and it looks like it's just an empty object. And we'll look at the second one, and hey, awesome. There's the to-do that we made in the last section. So I just want to reiterate what happens here, and we went over this on a previous section, but let's go ahead and it's worth reiterating. The way that Firebase is working here is we render our component one time, And the first time through, we don't have any items whatsoever. It's just an empty object. When this component gets appended to the DOM, so it shows up inside of our browser, we initialize our connection to Firebase, and that tells Firebase, hey, go out and fetch your data, please, and tell me what you get. When Firebase successfully fetches its data, it calls our render method again, and so we get a second console log in there. Since we render our list, or we render this component a second time, that also renders our list component, which is where we hid our little console log right here. So I just want to reiterate why we are getting a second console log in there. Okay, there's one more thing I want to talk about before we render our list of items, and that is to draw your attention to a little interesting tidbit here. We passed our header a property called item store, whereas we passed our list a property called items. So what's the difference in there? You know, why would we do that? And the answer is pretty straightforward. Item store is a direct reference to our Firebase object. We give it a direct reference to our Firebase object so that the header has the ability to create new items. Remember, the Firebase object is our connection to our remote database. List, on the other hand, for right now, this will change later, but for right now, it doesn't need to create any items. It doesn't need to make any connection to Firebase. So for right now, we just leave items as a plain object. Just here's the data. You don't have the ability to create any more to-dos. You just have the ability to read the existing ones. And so we just refer to it as items, and we pass it just the object containing our items. Okay, so let's go ahead and get back to rendering our list of items here. We now know that when we are inside of our list component, we have access to the list of items as this.props.items. And the first thing we want to do, as I said a few minutes ago, if we don't have any items, we want to show a message to the user saying, hey, you need to add an item before I'm going to show you anything here. So we will make a little convenience method here just to leave our render method nice and clean. We'll say this.renderList, and we'll put all the logic behind rendering our list of items into this little helper method. So we'll define our helper method, and we want to first capture the case in which we don't have any items right now. So totally empty object, nothing going on. So we'll say, we'll think about in what case, or how do we tell if we don't have any items. We don't have any items if this.props.items exists, and we'll talk about this in just a second. Object.keys, this.props.items.length is 0. And if that's the case, we'll return an H4 that just says add a to-do to get started. Okay, so what's going on here? Just a second ago, we console logged out our list of items, and we still have it up right here. So we basically just want to figure out whether or not this object, this.props.items, has any entries in it. We can get access to a list of those entries by using the JavaScript method object.keys. And what that does is we pass the method object.keys an object, and that returns us an array of all the keys. So in our case, the first entry in that array would be this ID right here. And then all we do is check, is the length equal to 0? If it is, then we'll post this note right here, add a to-do to get started. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this, see our page update, and sure enough, oh, that was kind of interesting, wasn't it? So for a second there, we saw the text add a to-do to get started, but then it went away. So let's think about what the heck just happened there. Well, as we've seen several times now, when our component first renders, we don't have any items because Firebase is still fetching its data, right? So during the first pass of our render, there are no items. Firebase then completes fetching its data, and all of a sudden, poof, we have an item. And thus, on the re-render, because we just fetched our data, our add a to-do to get started suddenly goes away. So that's a little bit awkward. We're going to have to figure out a way to handle that case in which we're still fetching data, and we don't really know whether or not the user needs to see this identifier or this notification right here. So we'll address that in just a little bit. Let's now just go ahead and finish up this example, or this rendering the list, by actually rendering our list of items if we have any. So if we have this condition right here checks if we don't have any items. So if we do have items, we'll be inside of this else. We're going to make an array called children, and then we will say we're just going to iterate over our object var key in this dot props dot items, and we'll say children dot push li item dot text. And then once we're back outside the for loop, we'll say return children. Cool. So what we're doing here is we're making a new array, and then for each item inside of our items object, each entry, each to-do, we're going to append onto that array an li that contains item.text. And here's something that's really interesting. Look at our return value right here. We're just returning the array. Believe it or not, React actually knows how to take an array of components and just go ahead and render it. So in the case that we have items, let's say that we've got like one item in here. Let's think about what the return value here is going to be. So I'm just going to comment this out for a second, and I'm going to just manually, we're going to pretend that we ran the function this.renderList and it returns something. We would expect to see something that looks like take the garbage out. So we have a UL and then just a plain old array, and that contains a li inside of it. Well, React actually knows how to handle this. So if we have an array of different LIs, we're actually going to React is actually going to correctly parse that and render that list of LIs. So let's clean this code back up. Just revert back to rendering the list. I'm going to save it. We'll flip back over. And it looks like item is not defined. Got just a little bit of a mistake in here. We didn't actually correctly reference our item. So our for loop has var key this props items. And we're just going to update that to this dot props dot items key and then text. So what we're doing here is we're saying look at the items object, access this given key, and then return the text property off of it. So let's go ahead and save it. We'll refresh, and there we go. So now we are correctly rendering our first to-do item. Let's refresh again, and we're just going to see that kind of effect again where it says, hey, please add a to-do to get started, and then all of a sudden it goes away, and instead we see our first to-do item. Let's talk about this array just one more time because I made that little mistake in there, and I just want to make sure everything is crystal clear. We have this object here, this.props.items. Each key represents a single to-do, so we're going to loop over all the keys, and then for each key we're going to access the object that it represents, and then we're going to access the text property. That's going to be put inside of an li, which gets put in turn inside of the children array, and then the children array will get rendered inside of our UL. All right, fantastic. So let's, in the next section, fix the issue where we first see added to do to get started when our app first shows up.